So, Alex, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I'm super excited that we connected on Twitter. I guess a shout out to Ryan Lind, who I don't know personally, but it seems like maybe you guys do. And
Yeah.
I'm really grateful that he kind of connected us. And yeah, I'm just super excited to explore, Paul Tillich and prayer and adventure and all these wonderful ideas with you. And yeah, just to get a chance to know you at a deeper level. So thank you for being a guest.
Well, thanks for reaching out, man. This is pretty cool. It's not super often that people find my wheelhouse to be of a lot of interest. So yeah,
Yeah, I'm pretty eclectic and I'm all over the place. My wife just thinks I'm nuts, but I
sure.
I I kind of I was actually the guy that I was talking to last week. We were just I don't know that we had the best language for it, but we were just saying that we kind of follow the energy in our psyche in terms of what interests us. And for a variety of reasons, Paul Tillich has kind of been a figure that's been really important to me. And then just lately, he's kind of come up again. And shoot, he's even kind of come up in the larger cultural landscape a little bit. I don't know if you saw the interview with Harrison Ford, where
Yeah,
he
I saw you posted that. I didn't check it out, but yeah, I did notice that, which is super rare,
isn't
right?
that crazy?
Yep.
Like in fact, are you okay if I just kind of read it real quick? Because I thought he had some interesting things to say. Yeah, he said there's this Protestant theologian named Paul Tillich who wrote that if you have trouble with the word God, take whatever is central and most meaningful to your life and call that God. My mother was Jewish, my father was Catholic, and I was raised Democrat. My moral purpose was being a Democrat with the big D, but it didn't apply to a political point of view so much as it applied to nature. I didn't have any religious construct, but I do think that nature and God are the same thing. The mysterious origin of life, science tells us how it happened, prophecy tells us another story. I found that everything in nature, the complexity, the biodiversity, the symbiotic relationships, it's the same thing that other people attribute to God. Now, aren't you glad you asked that question? Now let's get back to the funny shit.
Nice, nice, nice. That is super cool.
Yeah. So, okay, before we kind of jump into Paul Tillich and some of your incredible articles that I had the privilege of reading over the last few weeks, I kind of wanted to ask you about a couple of the roles that you seem that you have in your life. You have these categories on your social media, and I kind of wanted to start with, I guess, the role or the identity marker, feral theologian, which I've never heard. I thought that was such a cool way to put it.
Yeah.
What does that mean, feral theologian?
Well, yeah, I that came up as I was trying to describe a job transition that I was undergoing,
Got you.
and so it was a weird thing that I ended up in a theology program at all, and a PhD in particular. I've never seen myself as especially academic, and so it was an odd twist of life that I found myself in that place. And then my wife and I decided that trying to go through with you know adjunct teaching positions and chasing temporary spots wherever you can find them across the country, that kind of stuff, just really wasn't the life that we wanted for us and our small kids.
Sure.
We decided to move back to my hometown of Fergus Falls, Minnesota, where we both felt like just really deeply at home every time we would come to visit. And we came back here and rooted ourselves. And that was in 2016. I finished up my PhD that year and began building a house, and that is still ongoing. But
And like literally building a house.
literally building a house, right?
That's
So
incredible.
I had built, not so much as a dog house prior to that. So between having the time to do it and the wonders of YouTube and knowing how to know when you don't know things and how to ask the questions and find
Mm,
people that do, allowed me to like do most of it myself. So that took a long time, and then from that point on, and that was good. I would say that felt wonderful to go from creating this intellectual structure in the form of a dissertation
sure.
everybody looks at, and I don't know what you're doing. Like, I don't know what you're doing with your time. I don't know. Like, all this is just a deep mystery to everyone who knew me. And then to take my energy and give it to something where I could just go, that's what I'm doing. I'm making a house you can walk through the rooms and I can show you how I'm doing it. And that felt really good to do something that tangible for a season. But at the end of that season, when we moved in, we needed to pay for said house. And, I looked around at what my options were as a highly educated, deeply unemployable human being at that. And I became an electric utility meter reader.
Oh, okay.
Actually, a job that still exists in some form in some places of the country, where I would literally walk around through people's backyards in small towns throughout western Minnesota and eastern North Dakota, and put on foot between 12 and 20 some odd miles a day. Uh,
Wow.
and and that was kind of an identity crisis experience
Mm.
a bit, right? Who am I? What have I come to? So I worked through a certain amount of that. And I think it was around that time that Twitter showed up on my radar,
Okay.
which was kind of fun, because now for the first time I could curate this little community of people that were interested in the idiom that I was interested in speaking out of. And that was really fun. So from there, I transitioned out of meter reading like last September into prairie reconstruction work. So
Yeah,
that's
man, I don't even know what that is, but that was one of the ones I was going to ask you about. Sounds
sure.
really interesting.
So when you talk about God in the natural world kind of stuff,
Mm.
this was a huge thing for me. I I came to the realization, as I was doing my work, driving through, these small towns and back roads and stuff, I would find these little chunks of native prairie that had never been tilled and were filled with an unbelievable diversity of life. And so I
Mm.
would stop and I would just spend time in them. And every time I would, depending on where the season was, everything was different. There were different plants, there were different little insects, and it deeply surprised me. I didn't realize that this kind of interconnected, beautiful, unexpected natural life existed right around where I lived. I was always used to experiencing that somewhere far away in the mountains, right?
Sure.
On the north shore of Lake Superior, where there was just this rugged wildness. So that was an exciting thing for me. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about my connection to the natural world through prairie plants, and have actually been doing a lot of growing and seed collecting and these
Mm.
kind of things myself. Uh, so yeah, it was reflecting on that transition out of meter reading into the prairie reconstruction stuff, because um, there was a sense in which I was just out in the field then. At that point, I was doing work on federal land properties and things like that, and it was, I was still thinking theologically the whole
Mm.
time, but I was not within the structures of cultivated theological thought any longer. I
Got
was
you. That's the
feral.
Pharaoh. Yeah, yeah.
Feral in the sense that I'd been turned loose, right? Doing my thing outside the walls of the typical forms that occurs in.
Sure. Oh man, I love that. I appreciate you kind of like narrating that part of your life. So if I can just take maybe one step back in terms of the PhD program, and I think it was Luther Seminary.
Yep.
Why that institution? What drew you there? Was there a certain thinker, or was that your tradition?
Sure. So I began thinking theologically in any sort of a formal way through blogging, when blogging was just beginning to be a thing in like the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And so I started connecting with a lot of atheists, and they all seem to be from Great Britain for some reason. Really smart dudes, and then one Anglican guy from New Zealand, and that began like this community of conversation that occurred for, I don't know, 3-4 years,
Wow.
and I loved it. I loved it. I mean, because they would just, their minds were relatively free, and they were curious and interested, and we would have all these really fun fights online together. And so I just decided, like, I need to figure out what I believe, right? Because
Mm.
oh boy, this doesn't feel right. Like my honesty just seems to lead me in directions that seem to like impact the meaning of my life and that kind of stuff. So
Sure.
I decided at the time I was exposed to like Greg Boyd. I don't know if you've ever heard of him.
I have, yes. He was like big in like the open
Yeah.
theology scene for a while.
Yep, open theism, and he was just like he just seemed like a genuinely decent human being, and I just liked him. So I figured, well, if Bethel University, so this is my master's degree, if Bethel University is good enough for Greg Boyd, it's good enough for me. I
Mm.
guess I think far enough into that real to realize that he didn't wasn't able to hang around at Bethel. And so I went to Bethel. I did my master's there and discovered that it was a uh, ideologically deeply divided institution at the time.
Mm.
Um, and so I would have spiritual formation professors, systematic theology professors, philosophy professors that I deeply resonated with, and then
Gotcha.
oftentimes in the more biblical studies side of things, uh, I was a thorn in the side of of the professors there, and I don't know. I think it may have been that I didn't come from evangelicalism. I came from Catholicism.
Okay.
That was my upbringing, and I just always had a critical mind, and that may have been mistaken for intellectual rigor, because I was
Mm.
encouraged to go on to do a PhD because I always kept pushing the boundaries of things and asking questions, and some of my professors thought that was neat. So um, and it was Tillich that led me towards Luther. I had a rogue scholar friend of mine at the church that we were attending at the time who kind of like almost like a dirty magazine passed me Paul Tillich history of Christian thought like under the table at coffee hour one day.
I
Um,
do wonder what the centerfold of Paul Tillich would have been.
right? And that book, it's a weird like that's a weird way into Paul Tillich, his History of Christian Thought lectures.
Mm.
That's just not a typical way people find him, but it's what I needed, and it was so healing for me. And so I found out that there was a scholar at Luther, Dr. Lois Malcolm, who Tillich was kind of her theologian in a lot of ways. So I
Okay.
met with her, and that's how I found my way into Luther. And Luther was, for me, just such a healing experience,
Wow.
for the first time, I was able to feel faith in a way that wasn't also tearing me apart. um,
Mm.
like it was so freeing, and so I still hold a very very warm place in my heart for my PhD experience.
Got you. Wow.
Yep. Yep.
Now, Alex, whether it's that first time reading Tillich or anything at the seminary or in your PhD program, can you reflect on maybe some of the things that began to change, like maybe like a paradigm shift, or what were some of the ideas that you were wrestling with that gave you that sense of freedom that you're talking about that was so healing?
Right. So like the core of it for me, um, was the way Tillich talks about paradox, and
Okay.
paradox is at the heart of what he calls final revelation
Mm.
in Christ. So he has this way of talking about how Christ is the final revelation in the sense that he was able to be completely transparent to like I struggle like spitting this stuff out because Tillich he tends to be so abstract that his ideas don't resonate well with a lot of folks. So forgive me if this is too obtuse, but he was able
No,
to
that's
like,
good. Go for it, man.
become completely transparent to the divine ground, right? So he's able to manifest the depth of being, and in the process, give himself away completely without losing himself.
Mm.
And it was in that the giving of himself away completely without losing himself. There's there's and this paradox at the heart of it has like so many different ways into it, but that
Sure.
was that was one way that I remember going, this is interesting, because everything that I'd been exposed to prior to this was me trying to save Christ,
Mm.
save the heart of the tradition, like prove him historically through, really good arguments about how, the women at the tomb would never have been included as source material because they were untrustworthy at the time, this kind of stuff.
Right. Kind of apologetics.
Yeah, exactly. To try to hold on to the thing. And I felt if I could prove it with enough good arguments, that then the meaning of the tradition and the meaning of the, my life, therefore, would hang together. But that was always a anxious place to be, because you could never prove, the unconditional.
Right.
It
Right.
doesn't work like that. And to the extent that you feel like you must, or that God hangs on arguments, they're always, if you have any shred of honesty, like always have to be open to doubt. Like, because we're not infinite. We can't know the past. Like any historical argument is always tentative, open to change, open to revision upon new evidence, and all that kind of stuff. And that's not the logic of faith.
Mm.
That's an anxious place to live. That's a fearful place to live. And so what I realized in that is that the paradox of Christ, in a certain way, manifesting the divine in not like being absolutely present, but in actually the love that lets go. For the first time, I felt as though that the letting go, the release, was the doorway to the freedom, and that you really can't take that away anymore. You can't lose that because it already lost itself.
Wow. That's powerful. Yeah. So do you think before you were kind of more in a state of, wanting to control or holding on, and through Tillich's work, you kind of shifted to that letting go paradigm.
Yeah, right.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Were you struck at all by, the way he talks about God as the ground of being, and language around ultimate concern? And I guess I'm curious in terms of even like theology proper, did you go through some changes in how you thought about, the divine?
Oh, definitely,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah. So, I mean, in the logic of it is fairly similar. I mean, God went from a thing out there separate
Mm,
from myself, who may or may not exist, that I, could access or prove or justify on the basis of more or less good argumentation,
sure.
which was a stressful place to me because I was never super great at like these intricate philosophical arguments. I didn't find them interesting, and so it's like that was a bummer of a place to be like, oh man, my faith hangs on like, whether these arguments cash out, but I don't really care about them. I'm not
Right. Oh
about
man.
them. And yeah, so the shift was basically from thinking of God as a possible object of my thought, as a possible thing separate from myself out there, to that which lies beyond the split of all separations and is at the heart of everything, and
Mm,
therefore at the heart of myself as well. And that's why faith as ultimate concern makes sense. If at the very depth of ourselves is a point of connection with divinity itself, like, it makes sense. Like
yeah.
our faith comes from God, and our faith is actually a manifestation of God. And so there's been a couple ways that have been kind of helpful for me to think about that in the time that has gone on since then. One is, I think I first heard this by Philip Carey. I forget what university, I think Eastern University, I think he's from. He had a series of lectures on Plotinus. And
Okay. Yeah.
talks about Plotinus's myth of the sphere, and I love
Mm,
it because I feel like it gets its arms around so much in a really simple image. He says, imagine all reality, all existence is a sphere, right? And we are like faces. All of us are faces on the outside of the sphere, and we're all looking out.
mm,
And as we look out, we experience ourselves as separate, disconnected, capable of conflict. I need my space, you can't take mine, and these sorts of dynamics. But the moment of spiritual change occurs when, instead of looking out, our faces turn and look in.
mm,
And when that motion occurs, you see that your very being is radiating from a center from which all other being is also radiating. Now, at that point, you realize that none of us are absolutely separate from each other, and that all of us are connected. And the divinity is not something that is separate from ourselves either. It's something from which we are all also connected. And I feel like that gets its arms around a much more ancient way of feeling reality.
Mm.
It gets its arms around a lot more of how early theologians like Aquinas and Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, and these earlier thinkers thought of divinity much more in those terms. And in the centuries preceding, or not preceding, but the centuries that came after, God became not the center of all things, not the heart of every, the deepest reality of anything that is. God became something out there, another being in the world of beings that may or may not exist, the highest, of course,
Sure.
but not something that we can know in an inward sense in any way. So we've really lost that art of inwardness, I feel, which that's part of the centering prayer thing for me as well. So that changes things a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, well said. And I'm glad you made the comment about the centering prayer, because I think it's a good time to maybe transition into that phenomenal article that you wrote. I love the title, Prayer Doesn't Work. If you're cool with it, I have there's a line from it that I think kind of captures it really well. And I was just hoping maybe you could just talk more about, yeah, the article and kind of what it means to you. So you say, my constant refrain through it all has been that prayer does not work. The reason for this, I've tried to show, is that work is a bad metaphor for what happens in prayer. To a certain extent, any word taken from the realm of our normal experience will inevitably be inadequate when applied to God's eternality. But the word work is especially ill suited, connoting as it does something within our control that can be mastered with technical proficiency. So, in light of that kind of statement and what you were just describing in terms of, locating God at the center of all things, how does that conception of divinity help us think about prayer, what it is, what it's not? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, to begin with, in the simple way of thinking about it, if prayer is, if we think of it in two terms that just are too familiar and normal to us,
Mm-hmm.
and it's easy to think of basically a conversation with another being that is separate from ourselves. That you know, this my temperament just never was well suited to this to begin with. But so then we have this conversation, and God is a weird sort of object in that we don't like typically hear a voice back. We don't see that towards which prayer is directed in that way. And in some sense, folks get trained to then start just scanning the world for evidence that it was heard, or that their prayers have been answered, or that they did it right, that they're praying from a right place within themselves, that their desires are pure, and it can become a painful process for people, especially when one's critical awareness starts to get peaked a little bit, and just the whole apparatus of how God is thought about starts to break down a little bit. Prayer starts to feel potentially a very lonely, futile, silly experience
Yes.
under those conditions.
I think too, if I can just like pause you real quick, from my personal experience and then working with a lot of people in therapy that wrestle with anxiety, particularly OCD. I don't want to make a blanket statement. This is always the case with prayer, but I know for myself and for many others, it almost became a compulsion or a way that actually our anxiety got worse. And we did the checking thing that you're describing, and it became like this unhealthy obsession. And so, yeah, I think it's usually framed as something that can help people soothe their anxiety, but I think oftentimes it actually exacerbates it, or can.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And there's also the phenomenon known as spiritual bypassing. That
Absolutely.
heard of that too, right?
Yes,
Like,
sir.
yep. And using that act as a way of not confronting the real, psychic movements that are happening within ourselves and our relationship.
Right.
Um, and so centering prayer is I should just describe it for those who are not familiar with it. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
please.
disarmingly simple process. It's very akin to Zen meditation.
Mm,
Um, it does not have an objective focus. It's really a practice of intention and release. Um, so the practice is one sits in a comfortable position, and there is a word that one chooses beforehand. It's typically called the sacred word. It's not chosen for the content of its meaning, but as a sign of intention. And one sits for, I don't know, typically 20 minutes or so. Set a timer so you're not thinking about, am I done yet? That kind of deal.
yeah.
And you sit and you let your mind, as much as you can, just gently just release. And anything that is a thought that comes to you, from anything from a bodily sensation to a memory to a worry, or starting your to-do list in your head, or an image, or any of these things, anything
Right.
that occurs to you, you often, while repeating the sacred word, you just gently, that's a huge part of it, just
Mm,
gently release. And they come back, the thoughts always keep coming back typically. But that's it. That is all you do. You sit,
yeah.
they come to you, and you gently release. And it's intended to engender a a graceful posture towards yourself.
Mm,
um, it is intended to create a form of awareness that is not focused on a particular thing.
mm.
It's a form of awareness that's not already wrapped up in your normal program of life of trying to preserve yourself and extend yourself and make your money and make your
Right. Be
food.
productive and successful.
Yep, exactly, all that stuff. Um, and and that is interesting, in that, to the extent that our focus tends to so often become predominated by our everyday mode of experience, like the
Mm,
program, the story that we're running in our head, our attention and the way we direct it, and the stories that we're filtering it through, very often just shaves off unbelievable amounts of life and experience and
mm.
possibility and potential in the process. And to the extent that God is reality and the deepest, truest part of anything that's real, we're not connecting in fruitful ways with God. Our life is not a prayerful experience, to the extent that we've formed too rigid of ideas of how it needs to go.
Mm.
um, and so centering prayer is a way of kind of breaking that open, allowing us to be more attentive and responsive to what is, both within ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. And I hadn't made some of the connections, but I just think Paul Tillich and his theology is just a beautiful way to like undergird the practice of centering prayer. I just so enjoyed, and I would encourage anyone to go and actually read the article. I'll include the link in the show notes. I think you just do a masterful job of exploring how his theology kind of serves as a it's like a theological framework to help us make sense of something like centering prayer. So thank you for making those connections. That was great.
I'm really glad you picked that particular paper out too. I didn't do a ton of writing while I was doing my academic stuff. That was an opportunity that was floated to me by a friend of mine who was in with the Word and World people, and I didn't have time to write it. Right? Like,
Sure.
I didn't have time to think about it. I just had to
Right.
bang it out quick. Got to get this thing done. The deadline's coming, and it's funny how often some of the best things you end up producing are when you're not overthinking it, especially for
Oh,
someone like.
so true.
But so I finished that, and I got the draft back from the editor gal, and she said, I've been working here editing these papers for 40 years, and she said, this is my favorite paper I've ever read.
Wow, man,
I
what
can
an
be done.
affirmation, dude. You can just go. That you're
Yeah,
done.
yeah, yeah. No, that one stuck with me.
Yeah, no, it's very readable. And here's the thing, I don't know what I am anymore. I'm not sure I identify as a Christian anymore, but and I work with a lot of people who are kind of in the same boat. I just think that article and Paul Tillich and some of these things we're talking about, yes, will benefit, Christians, but I think are for a much broader audience, people that are seeking and searching and wanting to wrestle with their ultimate concern and wanting to maybe figure out what it is that the sacred actually is and how they can relate to it. And so I think something like centering prayer can be something that even someone who's not in the Christian tradition can engage in at some level. I don't know if you would agree with that, but that's sort
Yeah,
of how I think about it.
yeah. I mean, I've always said that encountering Tillich was finding someone through whom I both lost and found my faith for the first.
Mm, man, that's a
Um,
really good way to put it. I like that.
and and as time has gone on, I continue to think that really the only kind of Christianity worth paying attention to is the kind that doesn't give two rips whether or not it's Christian.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, that's good.
like there's in, in both of
That's
these
good.
both of these things are those are both phrases that are around that paradox that I'm talking about,
Mm,
right? Because Christianity as a name, as a label, as a signifier of one's group status or something like that is like really uninteresting to me. Um, I find when I'm asked the question, "Are you a Christian anymore?" to not be. It doesn't get at anything that I'm really excited to talk about. Let's just put it
mm,
that way.
yeah.
And and even for our own self evaluation is like, well, if the point of faith is coming to know the really real in some way,
Mm,
to love it, um, then the labels and the names for the thing are so secondary. Um, so anyway, I feel like that last thought tapered off. And I'll stop
no,
there.
no, no, no. I love it, man. I'm just like so resonating with you. Do you think it's a pretty good time to maybe go into that second article that you wrote? And I have it in the show notes, but I forgot the name of it. It's on
Hmm.
adventure and
Oh man,
salvation. Oh,
yeah.
it's
What is
so good.
Paul Tillich? Something. Oh, Paul Tillich, Salvation and Big Unnecessary Crazy Travel Adventure. I think that's.
Yes, no, that's exactly it. So man, there's so much that I want to kind of explore there, but I was kind of hoping you could help us kind of get into it because I also wanted to talk about The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which I mentioned before we hit the record button that I rewatched for like the third time. It's a really great movie. And I don't think you quote that movie in that article, but you do in another blog that you sent me that kind of
Oh, yeah,
touches on the same ideas on
you're right.
adventure. So maybe you could explore, yeah, what led to kind of writing about Tillich, adventure, salvation. Like, how would you want to get into that? Because I think
Uh,
there's so much there.
sure. Well, it started with the flu. Um,
Okay.
I was really sick.
Oh
Um,
man.
I was really sick, and I was laying in bed, and I was just looking, just scrolling through YouTube, just looking for things that like would make me feel a little better in some way or another.
Sure.
And I got fixated on this guy named Alistair Humphreys, and
Yeah, that was interesting. I'd never heard of him, but that was so cool to read about.
yeah, he's a British professional adventurer, right? And so what he does is he just goes off on these goofy, pointless adventures, and videotapes himself and talks about it and stuff. and I just loved it. I watched him take a raft down a river in Iceland. You know, he had walked across, just like set off a journey across Iceland and tried to go over a glacier and went through some rapids and all this kind of stuff. And for whatever reason, that kind of activity has always been very compelling for me. I think of Into the Wild, Christopher,
Yeah,
you know, those those sorts of counter anti-cultural quests have
sure.
really gripped me, and I have to blame my aunt for that.
Okay.
She would always give me the very best books, and
Nice.
he was similarly kind of not really cut for this world kind of person, and so it goes back to her. So I was sick, and I was watching these things, and a friend of mine who's connected at Oxford in England said, "Hey, there's going to be a conference happening on Paul Tillich here. You should present a paper." And I'm like, "Yeah, uh, I'm going to be, Mr. Central Minnesota paper in Oxford. That's my people. That's where I belong." But I decided, well, I don't feel good. This isn't going to happen anyway. So may as well just, I don't know, write what you care about. Like, how do you connect
Mm,
logical thinking to your life in a way that moves you? And that's what I came to is like, there's something about adventure. There's something about this desire that's not specified, right? Just this pull towards the unknown out in the world.
yes.
This hope for experience, you know not what, um, and all that happens along the way. That I'm like, that's really fascinating because I I remember a quote by C.S. Lewis where he talks about his experience of joy, right?
Yeah.
And he spoke about it in terms of this desire so sweet that any satisfaction would be less than the desire itself, kind of thing. And
Mm,
I was just connecting those ideas and the unknown, the unspecified, but also just the fire within it as being something like there's a connection there with a life of faith, and also can be contrasted, I thought, fairly helpfully with what I call normal everyday life.
right. Like the quotidian.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Um, and I feel like oftentimes religion and our faith practices become just another element of normal everyday life.
Yeah,
and and of course, right? Of course, it has to the
it
extent
has
that
to.
in the world, it has to. Like bills need to get paid, you need to get the
Right.
lift fixed, and all that kind of stuff. But to the extent that it becomes just that, to the extent that we lose the ecstasy, that we lose the desire, uh,
Mm,
it becomes a shell. Um,
yeah.
and our lives become that way also. So yeah, there's a monk by the name of Sebastian Moore who's very important to a lot
Man,
of
I
my.
wondered about him. I'd never heard of him. I saw him in some of your writings. I flagged him. He's somebody that I want to go back and reread or read for the first time.
Yep, he's a theologian of desire.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's good stuff, and he talks about this bouncing off of like our particular desires versus what he calls the ground of desire itself, kind of thing, and very kind of
Mm,
tilted terms in that way. And and how our particular desires always, again, like the faces in the sphere, can become, to the extent that they're all isolated and conflicting and so forth, problems in our life and destructive. And the solution to this, in broad strokes, is finding that connection to the ground of desire itself,
mm,
to God. Um, and so he was talking about four openings to desire. Or to the ultimate ground of desire. I will forget them at this point. It's been a while. I know he talks about like one of them being like a relationship that moves from dependency to interdependency.
okay, I like that.
So um, taking taking relational initiatives, like having the courage to emotionally like leave yourself exposed in a way that invites real relational connection, versus the much more closed down self-protective approaches to other people that we normally do, being another opening. And anyway, so there's a list of them, and I thought, I think like this practice of just adventure could totally be another one of these. That was the impetus for it. And I took it from there. And again, like, you picked out the two best things I ever wrote. So don't read anything else.
Okay, I won't. No.
On the academic page.
So and I know this could get quite heady, but that's cool. Like I think we need to go there. In the article, you reflect on Tillich's distinction between depth and structure. Could you just kind of like talk a little bit about that and how that kind of informs your thinking on adventure?
And so Tillich, in the first volume of his systematic theology, you have reason and revelation, and then you have being and God. So he charts two very detailed ontologies around both of those. And the very highest level that we call God is the depth of being. The next level, so that's top level. The next level down is the structure of being. This is where we live. We live in the structure. Structure as related to depth, but the defining thing of structure is that it occurs in separation. Again, like getting back to the sphere,
Right.
Kind of deal. And separation is the presupposition of being able to reason at all, because rationality and reason is always a subject that is reflecting on a object.
Right.
It's not something that is a part of you immediately. There's a sense of separation, and the rational act occurs within that space.
Yes.
And that's just where we live. We live our lives as subjects separated from objects, trying to maintain our subjectivity and feeling threatened by the subjectivity of others, and
right,
turning other subjects into objects, and a lot of this kind of stuff. And so the normal everyday life occurs there. Prayer, and in very kind of special moments, we can have an experience where suddenly normal everyday life collapses for us, sort of like the turning inward moment.
Okay.
Where this is what Tillich calls ecstasy. It's a point of union where, for just a fragment of a moment, you feel not separated from all things. You feel united, like apart. You are God in a certain sense, right? Like, this is the enlightenment kind of moment that some have, and I think that we can, to a certain extent, cultivate. Because like, what happens with our engagement with other people in the world if we no longer feel everybody as a potential threat to us? What if we feel ourselves as being present in all things and all others? How are we motivated to treat other people if we feel them as, if we not think of them, but like feel them as ourselves in a way?
Wow.
Suddenly, I mean, this makes sense why people, after they kind of like have these realizations, start to feel like ecology in the natural world is sort of an important thing. Feel themselves as a part of these processes and interrelated relationships. This is why people will tend to think that no one is not worthy of love. That all people have a history and a story that we can understand and find ways to sympathize with. And it's a very abstract ontological picture, but I feel like the implications of it are, I mean, they're revolutionary for one's entire experience of life.
Mm.
And so, so that connects to adventure in that it cultivates, potentially it's one of those ways that can kind of cultivate those moments. But what I especially like about the adventure piece is the desire piece,
Okay. Yeah, I was hoping you would say more about that.
which I resonated with probably the most out of that. So, and that struck me from your last episode with the gentleman whose name I now forget, where he talks about the things you care about are not things that you choose, right? The things that light you up are more like these are what the gods give you, kind of thing.
Yes. Yes.
That line really stuck with me,
Mm.
and I feel like for me, it has something to do with um, just the world's a miraculous place,
Mm.
and it lights me up with its beauty, and I oftentimes lose contact with that as I work to finish this house that I've started building, make sure we are able to pay our bills, make sure that all the kids get to the things that they need to get to on time, and
Sure.
right, and so just you start to your experience of just being alive starts to kind of close down in ways that starts to feel kind of drab.
Mm.
Um, and so what the Alistair Humphreys encourages people to do is go on little adventures. He calls
Mm.
them micro adventures. See these little disciplined excursions into the unknown. You know, part of that for him is always involves jumping in a cold river or something, and stars in some strange location that you would never have thought of. But there's something about intentionally exposing yourself to the unknown that can kind of reconnect you with I don't know, that sense of desire and that spark of being alive.
Mm.
Part of that is also fear. Um, there's exposing yourself to some of the dynamics of life that we normally try to avoid: discomfort,
Right.
cold, wild animals that could be out there,
Sure.
uh, and these kinds of parts of living. Yeah, it's an interesting framework.
Mm. One of the things that's coming up for me is I think a lot of people, I've been in this place too in my life. We kind of think, okay, I know purpose and meaning and even like the meaning of life is really important. I've got to kind of try to figure that out. But it gets almost relegated to this intellectual space. And what I'm getting from you and your articles and just wrestling with Tillich again is not that the intellectual side isn't important. I think it is, but meaning and purpose and all of that is kind of an existential reality that we experience, and that's why the adventure piece is so energizing for me at the moment. It's like I can't just stay in my fucking head about this stuff. Like it's about actually getting out there and having an encounter with the depths.
Yeah, well, and so I'm gonna point everyone to a little bit of Alan Watts.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Love that
Into,
guy.
into Watts at all? Okay.
Yeah. In fact, the guy that I interviewed last week, our first interview was on it's called Beyond Theology, I think is the name of the book. We kind of did a discussion on one of Alan Watts' books. He's
I
great.
Okay, super good. Yeah, I feel like the man. I'm jazzed to see that he's getting a bit of a resurgence here through the
Yeah, me too.
days and stuff like that. But so I've been getting a lot more acquainted with him. Just as I'm at work, I'll just listen to some lectures and things. But he said
Sure.
something on the meaning
Doesn't
of
he have a
life.
great voice too?
Oh, man, and that's the bummer. Like when you get some of the audiobooks, it's just not the same.
I know. It's a huge disappointment.
Yeah, yeah. I love the way he just gets tickled with himself, and he just laughs.
Yes.
Yeah, there's just something so wonderful about that. But on the meaning of life thing, I can't remember this is in the book I'm reading right now or a lecture, but he basically said that life has no meaning.
Mm.
there's no meaning, because meaning is assuming that it's a thing that points to something else. Like words have meanings. They're
Right.
signs. They're shapes, and they point to something else. But life does not have meaning in that
Mm.
sense. It doesn't point to anything else. Life is the dance, and that's where again, like living life out of this sort of kind of adventurous mindset is it totally fits with that.
Mm.
Life is the exploration of, the wondering what's around, the next corner or over the next peak.
Yes.
Not to get anywhere specific. Like the end of the adventure is not the goal. It's being in it. And that's a different headspace.
Sure.
It changes how you're dancing your life, I guess.
Mm.
Or it at least opens the invitation that maybe your life is a thing to be danced.
Yes. Okay. So Alex, how would you, so if let's, how the word end can have like these two meanings, like almost like a telos, but it can also mean like a literal end to something. If life doesn't necessarily in terms of meaning, doesn't have an end like that we're trying to get to, but there is an end in terms of this is what it's about.
Sure.
How would you kind of understand? I mean, or let me not make an assumption, but do you see that distinction between those two ways of thinking about end in terms of your project?
Certainly. Yeah. So you're flat out asking me what the meaning of life is.
I am.
I'm biased and I could be wrong, but I feel
Aren't we
like
all? But I love it. Yeah. No, tell me your biased answer.
I'm an artistically inclined person. So the notion that our life is itself a work of art that
Mm,
is unfolding, that it is the end. The end is occurring every moment,
mm,
and you're part of making it. That that's the most compelling way for me to think about it these days. And I contrast that with the the form of faith that I was at, in my late high school, early college years, of the
sure.
end being, you don't go to hell.
Right.
You related yourself rightly or believed in the right way, the right thing, and then you got busy trying to make sure other people got out of hell too,
Mm.
and that's what life was. And so that was not super fun. Um, yeah, so I'm much more compelled by, like, our life is it's a form of play.
Yeah.
It it's dangerous when we take it too seriously.
Mm. Oh, well said, Alex. Okay, can we? Because I know I'll have to like sign off in just a little bit to rush to my office to see my first client this morning. But I was hoping we could get into the secret life of Walter Mitty just a little
Sure,
bit.
sure, sure.
I just wanted to hear from you, kind of what that movie meant to you, and maybe you could just riff a little bit on that. It's not the final scene, but it's one of the last scenes where I think we, for the first time, see the Sean Penn character, Sean McDonald, and he has this great line in there where he reflects on, the snow leopard and being in the moment. I just wanted to hear you kind of like reflect on that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, because I was reflecting on that in the blog post you read, when
Yes.
I had just I had just presented my paper, excuse me,
Okay.
in Oxford, and then I was flying back home. And on the way back home, I stopped in Iceland, and
Mm.
the
Oh,
idea
okay.
the idea was for me to do a quick micro adventure. So I
Nice.
hopped off the plane and I hitchhiked to the start of a trail in Iceland that took me up over the top of, how do you pronounce the Eyjafjallajökull volcano that blew its top in 2010. So I went like up along this river, just cascading waterfalls and the black rock and green lichens, and the the mist forming from the ocean as it ascended in elevation, and that was the context I was in as I was reflecting on the paper I just presented and the situation I now found myself in. And of course I had my enormous DSLR camera, like clipped to my pack, like bouncing along as I'm going there. And every spot I get to, I want to stop and take a picture. And I just realized that I was, in the process, uh, I was kind of becoming a consumer. I was kind of
Mm,
becoming something that I really don't hold a lot of esteem for. I was trying to like collect my experience as a sort of souvenir.
got
And,
you.
and so that moment in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, where you have Sean Penn sitting there with his enormous camera to photograph a snow leopard, and Walter has been really kind of doing his normal everyday life thing for quite some time until life starts to fall apart, where
Mm,
works for is being acquired, and his job is quickly falling apart, and he's kind of at this moment where he was hoping to find like one last little shred that is going to like fix the normal everyday life, the piece that he will find, and he will find the missing picture that he was supposed to be in charge of, and
mm,
that might save his job in some way or another, and things will be okay. And so that's kind of the headspace he's in at the time, and so he's looking for the Sean character who he's might have the photo, and he finds him up on this mountaintop, and and so he's having this conversation like, where's the photo, and Sean says, well, it's in the wallet I gave you, it's in the little picture slot.
yeah.
And Walter's like, that was a terrible idea. That was, oh, I couldn't find it, I threw it away, I was so mad. Um, and Sean says, well, I thought it would be a cute gesture, I was being.
Mm,
And Walter symbolizing normal everyday life at this point is like, oh, too playful, too playful. What were you thinking? And then just at that moment, the ghost cat shows up, the snow leopard, and so the Sean character just smiles with pleasure as he's looking at the cat through the photo, and Walter again, like, when are you gonna take it? Like, you're here to do the thing. This is your job. Like, take
mm,
it, take the photo. And the quote from Sean is that, well, sometimes I don't.
mm.
The moment, he says, when it's meaningful to me personally, sometimes I don't like the distraction of the camera, which for me, I think is descriptive of, like, that's a moment of ecstasy,
Yeah.
a moment of that union that I'm talking about, turning to the point of connection within life, a not allowing the separation, the hustle and the bustle of everyday life totally wash out that moment of being with this crazy, exciting, unasked for, totally gratuitous life that we live.
Mm,
Um, and so that's I think that's why that's a real meaningful kind of moment for me. And thank you for the question, because I had not put any of that together in my head before you
mm,
just asked me to spit it out here.
mm.
But I think that's what's going on there for me.
That's so powerful. One of the things that strikes me too is I was listening to you and just kind of thinking about the movie. The the number 25 photo, the picture that was going to be on the final like cover of Life. We what the Sean character calls the quintessence of life. We fantasize throughout the movie, what could this be? Is it some incredible landscape? And at the end, right, we discover that it's actually just Walter Mitty like looking at another photograph. Talk about the sacred in the quotidian,
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
quintessence of life can be found in that as well.
Yes. Yes. And thank you for that. And honestly, that is perhaps even a personal struggle of mine.
Mm, me
Uh,
too.
that I don't see that so much. So I get really interested in this, like, well, here's depth up here, and then here's structure down here.
Mm,
And the point is, not structure but depth, right? But that's not actually quite accurate in Tillich's ontology, because actually one of the things that occurs within structure for him is the relationship of structure and depth is actually
mm,
It's actually a
Oh,
part
that's
of
good.
um to end on a very obtuse note. But yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, Alex, well, let me ask this. How do I say your last name?
Well, if you're going to take a crack
Is
at it,
is it Blondeau?
no.
Okay.
We call it, we just say Blondeau, as if there's
Blondeau.
just an O at the end. And
Got you. Blonde.
that may not be true to the French roots that it came from, but that's
Okay. But Alex Blondeau. Okay. So would you mind just ending with the line of the podcast, which is just by saying continue the conversation?
continue the conversation.